Welcome back to the 2024-25 school year. I'm Lori Kane, Coordinator of Specially Designed Instruction for Network 2, and I'm here to talk about restraint, CPI updates, and reminders. For some of you, this truly will be reminders. For others of you, this will be new information. 2022 HB 1255 went into effect. That law prohibited the use of physical restraint in Maryland school systems, except under certain circumstances. It also prohibited the use of seclusion in all public schools and required additional accountability and reporting by school systems. Important to note, we've always had to provide data to the state regarding restraint. It just changed the criteria for when we need to do so and how we do that. Seclusion, what is it? Seclusion is confinement of a student alone in a room or enclosure or any other space from which the student is physically prevented from leaving during school hours. This is from COMAR 13A0804. Two criteria for it to be seclusion: alone in that room or space and physically prevented from leaving. Some additional clarification on that. So we're talking about a student alone in a location and they're prevented from leaving that area. Those could be situations like a room with a closed to locked door, or a room where the door is shut and we're standing on the outside of that door, not allowing the student to leave. It is also, or could be, a space with partitions that isolates the student and prevents that egress. It could also be using mats to create a blocked area and the student is unable to leave. None of those are allowable in any public school under any circumstance. They are allowable in our non-public schools under very specific criteria and guidelines and have to be reported. Again, seclusion, two pieces to it: alone and prevented from leaving, and that's not permissible in any public school. Restraint. What is it? A personal restriction that immobilizes a student or reduces the ability of a student to move their torso, arms, legs, or head freely. We may not use restraint unless it's necessary to protect the student or someone else from imminent serious physical harm. There's an asterisk by that because we're going to talk about what that means a little bit later. And other less intrusive non-physical interventions have either failed or have been determined to be inappropriate for that student. So we cannot use restraint unless we're protecting a student or someone else from imminent serious physical harm, and we've tried something else that either didn't work or has been determined to be inappropriate for the student. Restraint can only be used by staff currently trained in the appropriate use of physical restraint. In the ACPS, that's Nonviolent Crisis Intervention, CPI. Implementing restraint is limited to these individuals who are currently certified and trained in CPI. This does not mean staff who have previously been trained, but their certification has expired or lapsed. All AACPS staff who are current in the use of restraint would be trained annually. So what is imminent serious physical harm? We jumped to the federal regulations in order to give us a clear definition of that. It means bodily injury, which involves a substantial risk of death, extreme physical pain, protracted and obvious disfigurement, or protracted loss or impairment of the function of a bodily member, organ, or mental faculty. Remember, we're only allowed to use restraint if there is risk of imminent serious physical harm, and serious physical harm is defined on this slide. So if restraint or seclusion is used for a student with a disability, that is a student with an IEP or a student who is in the IEP process, and their IEP or behavior intervention plan does not include the use or consent for the use of restraint, the IEP team must meet within 10 business days of the incident to consider three things. We have to consider the FBA. Has there been an FBA completed? If there hasn't, we need to do one. If we have completed it, we need to consider whether or not that needs to be updated. We also need to look at the interventions that we're utilizing. So we have restrained a student, and what are sort of those things that are leading up to, or the things that we're doing to prevent the use of them? Do we need to change what we're doing? We also need to consider the behavior intervention plan. If they don't have one, we're likely going to need to do one. And if they do have one, are there changes that need to be made to it? Clearly something isn't working if we had to utilize restraint. So if we utilize restraint for a student who has not been identified as a student with a disability, the student must immediately be referred to the school's pupil services team or an IEP team. This is taken from COMAR, so we've further clarified pupil services team to be CDM or MTSS or the IEP team. It doesn't mean that we're going to necessarily complete evaluations for a student and find them eligible. It just means we need to be having conversations about, is there more going on? Is this a student who potentially has a disability? So additional clarification about the use of restraint. When we're talking about restraint, truly those methods to maintain that physical control by restricting all or portion of their body, that's considered physical restraint, and we have to document it as such. Examples of physical restraint and non-examples are listed on this slide. So examples of physical restraint are holding or moving a student against their will, and that includes a transport that's immobilizing all or portion of their body, or moving a student in a position that would not occur naturally, so they're not moving freely on their own. It is not holding their hand or placing a hand on the student's back or elbow as the student willingly moves with that staff member to another location. So if they're coming with us willingly and we're not immobilizing them, it is not a restraint. Physical escort is a temporary touching that is not prolonged and doesn't restrict the student's ability to move freely. That's included in those non-examples. So where is that line between physical escort and physical transport? Like I shared previously, physical escort is that temporary touching of hand, wrist, arm, shoulder, back. It does not restrict the student's ability to move freely. It's limited, so we're doing it for a short amount of time, and the physical touch is limited. And it allows that student to move in a natural manner, and they're moving on their own. However, physical transport are strategies taught during CPI that restrict the movement of a student. And once a student is held for any period of time with one or more parts of their body no longer able to move freely, then it is restricting their movement and it is considered physical restraint. All that to say is physical transport, which is a strategy we teach in CPI courses, is considered the same as a physical restraint and must be documented as such. Restraint reporting. If you restrain a student, you're going to utilize PowerSchool to document the restraint single incident form. That's what it's called. And the access to who can input that information is limited. We're talking registrars, discipline secretaries, administrators, those staff who are able to input major referrals are those who would have access to document the restraint. You're going to then print and sign the form and place a copy in the student's cumulative record. So we'll have record of it in PowerSchool electronically. We'll have that printed and signed copy in their cumulative record, and the information needs to go home to their parents within 24 hours as well. So if a student is restrained 10 or more times in a school year, you need to email me, Lori Kane, and I will report to MSDE. That is where those reporting requirements have changed a bit. I will complete the reporting to the state, and then I will reach out to the school team to conduct a student and school level review. When a student is restrained 10 or more times, the LEA, Anne Arundel County Public Schools, will be placed into corrective action, and a corrective action plan is created and submitted to the state. If you have any questions about restraint, about whether or not an incident was restraint, what you need to do following restraint, or how to be trained, please feel free to reach out to me, Lori Kane, at lpkane@aacps.org. And credit to Slides Go.